He paid $5 for a broken wagon no one wanted, and by nightfall, men who had never spoken his name would come looking for it. The sun hung low over the dry plains as Ethan Cole stood beside the crooked frame, one hand resting on splintered wood that felt older than the town itself, the kind of wood that held stories whether a man asked for them or not, and the kind no one bothered to listen to anymore. The trader had laughed when Ethan counted out the coins, slow and careful like they mattered, like $5 wasn't just pocket dust in a place where deals were made with handshakes and silence. But Ethan didn't answer, didn't look up, just took hold of the wagon reins as if he'd bought something worth keeping, something no one else could see. The wheels groaned when he pulled it down the road, a long, tired sound that echoed between empty storefronts and shuttered windows, and a few men glanced up from their posts only long enough to smirk before turning back to their business, because a broken rancher buying a broken wagon made perfect sense to them. Out past the last fence line, where the land stretched wide and quiet and the wind carried more truth than any man in town, Ethan stopped and looked it over again, slower this time, noticing things he hadn't before. The way the iron bolts were set deeper than needed, the way the rear panel didn't quite sit flush, like something inside had been sealed away on purpose, not by accident, and he ran his fingers along the grain, feeling a faint ridge where wood met wood in a way that wasn't honest. The air shifted then, subtle, like the land itself had drawn a breath, and Ethan turned without knowing why, his eyes settling on a figure standing just beyond the dust, still as stone, watching. She hadn't been there a moment ago, or maybe she had and he'd just failed to see her. But there she was now, a woman with dark hair pulled back and eyes that didn't wander, didn't soften, fixed only on the wagon as if it spoke to her in a language no one else remembered. Ethan didn't reach for anything, didn't speak, just waited, because out here words had weight and silence had more, and after a long moment, she stepped closer, her boots quiet against the dirt, her gaze never leaving the warped boards. "That wasn't meant to be sold," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying something older than accusation, something closer to certainty, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest before he could think to question it. He looked back at the wagon, at the uneven panel, the hidden seam, and for the first time since he'd handed over those $5, he understood that whatever he had bought wasn't broken at all, just buried, and the land around them seemed to agree. The wind shifting again, carrying a distant sound from the direction of town, faint at first, like footsteps gathering before a storm. Ethan straightened slowly, his hand still resting on the wood, and though he didn't know what was coming, he knew one thing clear as the horizon. By the time the sun disappeared, that wagon would no longer belong to silence. The woman did not move closer after she spoke, and she did not step back either, as if the space between her and the wagon was something she had already measured long before Ethan arrived, her eyes tracing the warped edges of the wood with a familiarity that did not belong to chance, and Ethan noticed then that she was not looking at the wagon the way a stranger looks at something curious, but the way a person looks at something taken, something remembered in silence for too long. He shifted his weight slowly, boots pressing into the dry earth, and glanced toward the horizon where the last stretch of town sat in a thin line of dust and fading light, and though he could not yet see them clearly, he could feel it, the change in the air, the kind that comes before people start asking questions they already think they know the answers to. "You from around here?" he asked, his voice low and steady, not challenging, just placing a marker in the quiet. But she did not answer right away, her gaze still fixed on that same narrow seam along the back panel, the place where the wood did not quite meet clean, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried no hesitation, only certainty. "It should not be here," she said, softer this time, almost to herself, and Ethan felt the words settle heavier than before, like they were not meant to accuse him, but to name something already broken long before he ever touched the wagon. He followed her eyes back to the panel and crouched down slightly, running his hand along the edge again, slower now, feeling the slight give beneath the grain, the hidden tension beneath something that had been forced closed, and he realized that whatever this wagon once carried, it had not been meant to travel like this, not through trade, not through hands that laughed and counted coins without looking twice. Behind him, the wind shifted again, stronger now, carrying with it the distant rhythm of hooves or boots or something in between, not loud enough to alarm, but steady enough to notice, and Ethan rose back to his feet, his shoulders straightening in a way they had not in years, not because he was preparing for trouble, but because something in him refused to step away now that he had seen the truth sitting just beneath the surface. The woman finally lifted her eyes from the wagon and looked at him directly, and there was no fear there, no anger, only a quiet weight that spoke of memory and something carried across time without permission. "They will come for it," she said, and this time there was no question in her tone, only a statement that did not need to be explained, and Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding, because he had already felt it in the wind, in the way the town had gone still behind him without him turning to look. He rested his hand again on the wagon, not gripping, just steady, as if acknowledging that whatever this was, it had already chosen him as much as he had chosen it, and for a brief moment the land around them seemed to hold its breath, the quiet stretching long enough to feel like a decision waiting to be made. Then, far off in the distance, a shape appeared at the edge of the road, then another, moving slowly at first, then more defined as they came closer, not rushing, not hiding, just coming, and Ethan did not turn away, did not reach for anything, did not ask another question, because he understood something now that the town had forgotten long ago. That sometimes the value of a thing was not in what it could buy, but in what it refused to be sold for, and whatever rested inside that wagon had already begun to change the way the world would look at him before the sun even had the chance to disappear. The figures on the road did not hurry, and that was what made them harder to ignore, because men who rushed carried fear with them, but men who moved slow carried something else entirely, something closer to certainty, and Ethan watched them come with the same stillness he had learned from years of watching storms roll across open land, knowing that some things could not be outrun and did not need to be. The woman beside him did not turn to look, as if she already knew who they were before they appeared, her eyes drifting once more to the back panel of the wagon, and this time she stepped closer, her hand lifting but stopping just short of touching the wood, like there was a line drawn there that even she would not cross without reason. Ethan noticed the hesitation, small but deliberate, and without speaking he reached forward instead, pressing his palm flat against the uneven seam, feeling again that quiet resistance beneath the surface, and then he pushed, not with force, but with patience, the kind used on stubborn gates and long-closed doors. At first nothing happened, just the low creak of old wood shifting against itself, but then a faint click echoed from somewhere deep within the frame, so soft it might have been missed if the world around them had not gone so still, and the panel gave just slightly under his hand. The woman's breath changed then, barely noticeable, but enough for Ethan to hear it, and he eased the panel back slowly, revealing a narrow compartment hidden between the beams, sealed away so cleanly that no careless eye would have ever thought to look for it. Inside, there was no gold, no coins, nothing that would glint in the sun or weigh heavy in a pocket, only a bundle wrapped in worn cloth, tied with a thin strip of leather that had darkened with age. Ethan paused, glancing once at the woman, and she gave the smallest nod, not permission, but acknowledgement, and he reached in and lifted the bundle out, surprised by how light it was, as if whatever it held carried more meaning than weight. He untied the leather slowly, the strip coming loose without resistance, and folded back the cloth to reveal a stack of papers, thick and yellowed, marked with ink that had faded but not disappeared, lines and symbols drawn with care, with intention, and at the center of the top page, pressed deep into the fibers, was a seal that did not belong to any town or office Ethan had ever known. The woman stepped closer then, her eyes fixed on the mark, and for the first time since she had appeared, something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but recognition, the kind that reaches deeper than memory. "They hid it well," she said quietly, and Ethan looked up at her, the words settling into place alongside everything else he had begun to understand, because this was not something lost by accident. It was something buried on purpose, wrapped in silence, and sold off as scrap to keep it that way. Behind them, the approaching figures were close enough now to make out shapes, hats, shoulders, the outline of men who had spent their lives believing they knew the value of things, and Ethan folded the cloth back over the papers carefully, Not rushing, not hiding, just placing it back into his hands as if it had always belonged there. The wind moved again, carrying dust across the ground in thin lines, and as the first of the men reached the edge of the property, Ethan understood that whatever lay inside that bundle was not something they were coming to buy, and not something they had ever intended anyone else to see, and he stood there with the wagon at his side, and the weight of something unseen resting in his hands, knowing that the quiet he had lived in for years had just come to an end without a single word being spoken. The first man to step forward did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than any demand could have, his boots stopping just short of the wagon as his eyes moved from the weathered wood to the bundle in Ethan's hands, and then finally to Ethan himself, measuring, not with anger, but with calculation that had been practiced over years of quiet decisions made behind closed doors. He was dressed cleaner than the others, coat pressed despite the dust, hat pulled low but not enough to hide the sharpness in his gaze, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost polite, like a man discussing business rather than something already decided. "That wagon was sold by mistake," he said, each word placed carefully, as if the truth could be reshaped simply by how it was spoken, and Ethan did not answer right away, his grip on the wrapped papers steady, his posture unchanged, because he had heard that tone before, the kind that expected agreement without asking for it. Behind the man, the others spread out without being told, not surrounding, not threatening, just present, forming a quiet line between the open land and the road back to town, their eyes shifting between Ethan and the wagon as if both had become part of the same problem. The woman beside Ethan did not move, her gaze now fixed on the man who had spoken, and there was something in the way she stood, grounded and unmoved, that made the air feel tighter, as if two histories had just stepped into the same space, without invitation. $5 is not a mistake," Ethan said finally, his voice low, even, not raised to meet theirs, but not lowered either, and the man's expression did not change, though something in his eyes narrowed slightly, the smallest shift of control slipping before being caught again. "You are paid to take it away," the man replied, adjusting his gloves slowly, deliberately, not to keep what was inside. The words hung there, heavier than before, because now there was no pretending left, no misunderstanding to hide behind, and Ethan felt the truth settle fully into place, that they had not come for the wagon, not really, but for what had been hidden within it, something they believed had never left their hands in the first place. He glanced down briefly at the bundle, then back at the man, and for a moment the wind seemed to fall completely still, as if the land itself was waiting to see what would be said next. The woman's voice came then, quiet but clear, cutting through the space without force. It was never yours to sell, and this time the shift was not small. Several of the men behind the speaker exchanged brief looks, not confusion, but recognition of something they had hoped would not be spoken aloud. The man in front let out a slow breath, his posture remaining composed, but the edges of his control now visible in the tightness of his jaw, and he turned his attention to her fully, studying her face as if searching for something he could dismiss. "You should not be here," he said, and it was not a threat, not spoken loudly, but it carried a boundary that had been drawn long before this moment. She did not respond, did not step back, only held his gaze with the same quiet certainty she had shown since the beginning, and Ethan understood then that whatever lay in the papers he held was not just valuable, it was inconvenient, the kind of truth that did not belong to men who built their lives on what others never questioned. The man shifted his weight slightly, then looked back to Ethan, his voice returning to that same calm tone. "Hand it over, and we can forget this ever happened." And for the first time, the offer sounded less like a solution and more like a closing door. Ethan stood there, the wagon at his side, the bundle in his hands, the weight of something unseen pressing into the moment, and he realized that this was not about money, not about ownership in the way the town understood it, but about whether something buried would stay that way or finally be seen in the light of day. And though no one moved and no one reached for anything, the space between them had already changed in a way that could not be undone. No one reached for the bundle, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed, not because it meant they did not want it, but because it meant they believed they did not have to, that time and pressure would do the work for them. the way it always had in a town where quiet agreements carried more force than loud demands. The man in front shifted his stance slightly, not stepping closer, but settling in as if he intended to stay as long as it took, and behind him the others mirrored that patience, spreading out. Just enough to fill the space without closing it, turning the open land into something narrower without ever touching it. Ethan could feel it then, the slow tightening, not around his body, but around the choice itself, the kind that leaves a man with only one direction even when it looks like there are many. He glanced once toward the wagon, the broken frame now standing straighter in his mind than it had before, no longer a piece of scrap, but a container for something that had outlived the hands that tried to hide it, and he thought of the moment he had paid those $5, the laughter that followed, the easy dismissal, and how none of it had felt like a mistake at the time, only now revealing itself as something else entirely. The woman beside him stepped forward then, not toward the men, but toward the space between them, her movement calm, measured, as if she were stepping into a place she had always known would be waiting, and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The men's attention turning to her without a word being spoken, their quiet confidence meeting something they could not quite place. "Those papers carry a promise," she said, her voice steady, not raised, but clear enough to settle into every ear present, a promise that was not meant to be forgotten. The man in front tilted his head slightly, studying her with a patience that felt thinner now, like something beginning to wear at the edges. "Promises change," he replied, and there was a softness in his tone that might have passed for reason, if not for the way it avoided the truth sitting plainly between them. "Only when people decide they do," she answered, and this time there was no hesitation, no space left for interpretation, just a line drawn as clearly as the horizon behind them. Ethan watched the exchange without interrupting, his grip on the bundle steady, but his thoughts moving in a direction he had not expected when the day began, because this was no longer about what he had found, but about what had been taken long before he arrived, and what it would mean to put it back where it belonged. One of the men behind the speaker shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the dirt, a small sound that broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone that time was passing, that the sun was sinking lower, and that whatever decision was coming would not wait for morning. The man in front exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to Ethan, and for a brief moment the calm slipped again, replaced by something closer to urgency, though it was quickly masked beneath the same practiced control. "You do not understand what you are holding," he said, and this time it was not a statement of superiority, but something closer to a warning, not of harm, but of consequence. Ethan met his gaze without shifting, his voice quiet when he finally spoke, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "I understand enough," he said, and that was all, no explanation, no argument, just a line placed where it needed to be. The wind moved again, stronger now, carrying dust between them in thin, restless lines, and as the light began to fade across the land, the balance of the moment shifted in a way no one could undo, because the choice was no longer hidden inside the wagon or wrapped in cloth. It was standing there in plain sight, waiting for one man to decide whether it would remain buried or finally be seen. The last light of day stretched thin across the land, turning everything a shade quieter, softer, but the tension did not fade with it. It settled deeper, like something choosing to stay rather than pass, and Ethan could feel it in the way no one moved, not the men, not the woman beside him, not even the wind for a moment, as if the world itself had paused to listen to what would come next. He lowered his eyes to the bundle in his hands, not to hide, but to see, really see, what he had uncovered, and this time he unfolded the cloth again, slower than before, letting the pages breathe in the open air as the fading sun brushed across them. The ink caught the light in uneven lines, old but deliberate, and as he separated the top sheet, the shape of the truth began to show itself more clearly, not just marks and symbols, but boundaries, signatures, a record of something agreed upon long before the town behind him had ever been built, long before fences had been drawn across land that did not belong to those who now claimed it. The seal pressed into the page was not decoration, it was authority, and even without knowing every word written there, Ethan understood its weight, because some things did not need to be read to be recognized. The woman stepped closer again, her voice low as she spoke, not to him alone, but to the space itself, as if the land were listening. "This is where the line was drawn," she said, her finger hovering just above one of the marks, never touching, as if respect demanded distance, not by them, but by those who lived here before them. Ethan followed the line with his eyes, seeing how it curved, how it held, how it refused to match the straight edges of the fences that now cut across the horizon behind him, and something in his chest tightened, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was not just paper, it was memory written down so it could not be denied, and yet it had been hidden, buried inside a broken shell, and sold off like nothing. Behind him, one of the men let out a quiet breath, and another shifted his stance, the smallest sounds, but enough to break the illusion that this moment belonged only to the two of them. The man in front stepped forward then, just one step, careful, measured, his eyes fixed now on the open pages, no longer pretending distance. "That document does not hold anymore," he said, and this time the calm in his voice carried strain beneath it, like something pushed too far to remain untouched. Things changed. Ethan looked up at him, then back at the paper, then at the land stretching wide and silent beyond them, and he spoke without raising his voice. "The land did not," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because they were simple, and there was no easy way to move around them. The woman did not look at Ethan when he spoke, but something shifted in her posture, a quiet acknowledgement, as if the truth had found its place without needing to be explained. The man's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just slightly, and for the first time since he arrived, he did not answer immediately, as if searching for something that would return control to him, something that would make this moment smaller, easier to contain. But the pages remained open, the lines remained clear, and the silence between them grew heavier, not empty, but full, filled with everything that had been ignored for too long. Ethan folded the cloth back over the papers again, not hiding them, just holding them together, and as he did, he understood that what he carried was no longer just a discovery, it was a decision waiting to be made, one that would not change the past, but would decide whether the past stayed buried or finally stood where everyone could see it, and as the last edge of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, the choice felt closer than ever, not in distance, but in weight. The night did not fall all at once, it settled in slowly, like a truth that had waited long enough and no longer needed to rush, and with it came a quiet that pressed against every man standing there, not empty, but filled with something heavier than words. Ethan stood still, the bundle held close, not hidden, not displayed, just present, and across from him the man who had spoken first seemed smaller now, not in stature, but in certainty, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not correct. The others behind him did not speak, but their silence had changed, no longer confident, no longer assured. Now it carried something closer to unease, the kind that comes when something long buried begins to surface, where everyone can see it. The woman stepped forward again, just one step, and this time there was no hesitation in her movement, no pause at the invisible line, as if that line had never belonged there to begin with. She did not look at the men when she spoke, only at Ethan, her voice quiet but steady, carrying the weight of something that had been carried across years without being spoken aloud. "They moved the lines," she said, her words slow, deliberate, after the agreement was made, after the signatures dried, after the land was already promised. Ethan listened without interrupting, his eyes steady on hers, because this was no longer about what he had found, but about what had been done long before he ever arrived. "They said the land was empty," she continued, and now her gaze shifted, not to the men, but to the horizon beyond them, to the wide stretch of earth that had never belonged to silence. But it was not empty, it was only unheard. The wind moved again, carrying her words outward, and for a moment it felt as if the land itself was answering, not with sound, but with presence. The man in front drew in a slow breath, his composure still there, but thinner now, stretched across something he could not fully control. "Stories change," he said, though this time the words did not land with the same certainty as before. "Records get lost. things are adjusted. He did not finish the thought, and he did not need to, because the truth had already been spoken in a way that could not be folded back into silence. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the dry ground firm beneath his boots, and he looked down at the bundle once more, then back at the woman, and something settled in him then, not sudden, not forced, but clear, like a line drawn without hesitation. "And this was never adjusted," he said, his voice calm, not raised, but carrying across the space with a steadiness that made the others listen whether they wanted to or not. The woman nodded once, a small movement, but enough, and in that moment the two of them stood not as strangers, but as witnesses to the same truth, one uncovered by chance, the other carried by memory. Behind them, the wagon creaked softly in the night air, the sound almost forgotten until now, like a reminder of how easily something important could be dismissed when it no longer served those who held power over it. The men did not step forward and they did not step back, but the space between them had changed again, no longer balanced, no longer equal, because what Ethan held was no longer just paper, it was something that could not be denied without denying what stood plainly in front of him. The man in front looked at Ethan for a long moment, searching, weighing, and then his gaze shifted briefly to the woman before returning again, and when he spoke this time, there was something quieter in his tone. Something closer to acceptance than control. "You think this changes anything," he said, not as a challenge, but as a question that had already begun to answer itself. Ethan did not respond right away, and when he finally did, his voice was softer than before, but somehow stronger. "It already has," he said, and the words did not need to be explained, because everyone standing there could feel it. The shift, the change, the moment where something hidden had stepped into the open and refused to go back, and in the quiet that followed, no one moved, because they all understood that whatever came next would not be decided by force, but by what a man chose to do when the truth was placed in his hands. The night held steady around them, not closing in, not opening up, just watching, and Ethan could feel every pair of eyes fixed on the bundle in his hands, waiting, not for a command, not for a signal, but for a choice that none of them could make for him. The wagon stood behind him, quiet now, its purpose already fulfilled, no longer hiding anything, just a hollow frame that had carried truth farther than it was ever meant to travel, and the land stretched wide beyond it, unchanged, untouched by the lines men had tried to force across it. Ethan drew a slow breath, not deep, just enough to settle something inside him, and then he stepped forward, one pace, measured, deliberate, the sound of his boot against the dirt carrying farther than it should have in the silence. No one moved to stop him, and that was the second thing he noticed, because the moment for stopping had already passed, and now there was only watching left. He did not look at the man in front, did not acknowledge the others, his attention fixed only on the woman standing across from him, and as he reached her, he held the bundle out, not as an offering, not as a gesture of surrender, but as something being returned to where it had always belonged. She did not take it immediately, her eyes meeting his first, searching, not for permission, but for understanding, and in that quiet exchange something passed between them that did not need to be spoken, something simple, something clear. Then she reached out and took the bundle, her hands steady, careful, as if she were holding something that had never stopped being hers, even when it had been hidden away. The movement was small, almost nothing, but it shifted the entire space around them, because now the weight was no longer in Ethan's hands, and what had been uncertain had found its place. Behind them, one of the men let out a breath he had been holding too long, another lowered his gaze slightly, and the man in front stood still, his posture unchanged, but the authority in it no longer absolute, no longer unquestioned. Ethan stepped back again, returning to where he had stood before, his hands now empty, but not lighter, just different, as if what he had carried had left something behind in him that would not go away. The woman turned slightly, not away from the men, but toward the open land, and for a moment she held the bundle close, not tightly, just enough to acknowledge it, and then she spoke, her voice low, not directed at anyone, but heard by all. "It will be remembered," she said, and the words did not sound like a promise, they sounded like a fact. The wind moved again, stronger this time, brushing past them, lifting dust in thin lines that caught the last traces of light, and the moment stretched, not breaking, just settling into something final. The man in front looked at Ethan one last time, his expression unreadable now, not anger, not defeat, just something quieter, something that understood what had happened even if it could not be undone, and then he turned without another word, the others following in silence, their steps slow, measured, not hurried, because there was nothing left to chase. Ethan watched them go, not with satisfaction, not with relief, just with the same stillness he had carried all day, and when the last of them disappeared into the darkening road, the land seemed to breathe again, the tension lifting not all at once, but enough to feel. He stood there beside the empty wagon, the quiet returning, but not the same quiet as before, this one deeper, steadier, as if something that had been waiting beneath it had finally been seen, and though no one said anything more and nothing else moved, the choice that had been made remained, not loud, not celebrated, but clear enough to last long after the night had fully settled. Morning came slow across the land, not with noise, not with urgency, just a quiet wash of pale light stretching over the same ground that had held so much weight the night before, and Ethan Cole stood where he had always stood, just beyond the reach of town, beside a wagon that no longer held anything but empty wood and the memory of what had once been hidden inside it. The wind moved gently now, carrying no tension, no distant footsteps, only the soft rustle of dry grass bending in the open field, and for the first time since he had pulled that broken frame across the dirt road, there was nothing coming for it, no voices, no offers, no quiet demands dressed as reason. The wagon creaked once, a hollow sound, lighter than before, as if it too had been relieved of something it was never meant to carry, and Ethan rested his hand against the worn wood again, not searching this time, not questioning, just feeling the surface for what it was, nothing more, nothing less. Down the road, the town had already begun to wake, but slower than usual, as if something had shifted in the night that no one had the words to explain, men stepping out onto porches with eyes that lingered a little longer than they used to, conversations starting and stopping before they could take shape, the weight of what had been seen refusing to settle back into the silence it once hid inside. No one came to his land that morning, no one called out, no one asked what had happened, and that absence spoke louder than anything else could have, because out here, people only stayed quiet when they understood more than they wanted to admit. Ethan turned slightly, looking out over the stretch of land beyond the wagon, the same land that had been drawn and redrawn on paper, claimed and sold and forgotten in pieces, and yet still stood exactly as it always had, untouched by the lines that men argued over, unchanged by the hands that tried to own it. He thought of the bundle now gone from his hands, the weight of it, the way it had felt both small and heavy. At the same time, and how easily it could have been kept, traded, turned into something that might have changed his own life in ways the town would understand, and yet none of that had followed him into this morning. Instead, there was something else, something quieter, something that did not show in coin or land or recognition, but sat deeper, steady, like a line drawn where it should have always been. A figure appeared far off in the distance, small at first, moving along the edge of the open land, and Ethan watched without shifting, recognizing the pace before the shape became clear, the same calm, measured steps that had carried no doubt the night before. She did not come close, did not cross the space between them, only paused for a moment where the land opened wide, her presence there enough to be seen, enough to be known, and though no words passed between them, there was no need for any, because what had been returned did not belong to either of them alone. It belonged to something older than both, something that did not require acknowledgement to remain true. The wind carried lightly between them, brushing past without resistance, and after a moment she turned and continued on, her figure fading slowly into the distance until she became part of the land itself again, unseen but not gone. Ethan stood there a while longer, the quiet settling around him fully now, not empty, but complete, and then he stepped back from the wagon, leaving it where it stood, not because it no longer mattered, but because its purpose had already been fulfilled. By midday, the town would move on, the conversations would shift, the questions would fade into other concerns, but something would remain, something small and unspoken, the knowledge that not everything could be bought, not everything could be buried, and that sometimes the only thing a man truly owns is the choice he makes when no one can force his hand. Out here, the land does not remember names. It remembers truth, and that morning, for the first time in a long while, the two had met again in the open light.